Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a fun one. I'm slowly getting back into reading. My brain is just about letting me do that. And I've read a few of these lovely books, many books in translation actually this week, just by pure coincidence from what I had out from the library. But yeah, let's get talking about some of those books. First up, I read Human Acts by Kang and translated by Deborah Smith. And I was particularly intrigued by this for several reasons. So, as you may know, Kang recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and as a result, a lot more focus has been put on her former works. She's got a new book out soon, which I'm just about to start. I'm very, very excited for it. And this book is seen as one of those ones that you probably should read from her back catalogue. At least that's what the lovely people of BookTube have been telling me. And I think this is a really phenomenal book in many, many ways. So the core idea of it is the 1980s saw a huge wave of protests in South Korea, where Kang is from, and particularly in Gwangju, a city that Kang is from and where I used to live. I lived there for 2 years. And so there's a personal element of this for me of, although I obviously wasn't there during the protests and the uprisings, I saw a lot in the city of memorials or statues or various other parts in the local museum that were all talking about these set of incidents that happened, particularly in Gwangju, as a resistance against the then president of Korea. But particularly, it was seen as quite a strong move towards justice and democracy at the time, these uprisings. And it's an incredibly important thing. And she mentions in the end part of this book, or rather, there's an afterword in the book that talks specifically about the how this is relevant for the time. And particularly South Korea also saw other recent political moments happen in the last few months, but also in the last 10 years that have triggered memories of all of these moments. Anyway, all of that is a bit of backstory to what this book is. And I think this is a really phenomenal way of doing, I was going to say historical fiction. I don't know if it's technically long enough for it to be historical. It's in the past in some ways, and it's a book that talks about it. But this book, I think, does a really exceptional job of finding some of the human stories in amongst it all. And particularly, we focus in this book on a young man who is trying to find a friend of his. And what I think comes through really strongly in this book is just the absolute chaos that comes out of a big moment like this. That for all of the bravery and kind of courage that people go into these things with, of we're going to resist this government, we're going to do whatever it takes, we're going to do whatever it needs, there is some aspect where there's always an unpredictable element to it. And so many of the characters are caught up in really trying to understand some of the barbarism they're seeing around them, but also trying to find a sense of home or belonging or peace in amongst all of this. It's a really hard going book at times, but I think so beautifully done for capturing those little moments of how somebody might try to keep humanity and keep hope in a moment that is otherwise fairly hopeless and feels inhumane. And I think this is just an exceptionally done book. Also really interesting in the sense that I think, even though she has a consistent style, I find Kang's writing really interesting for how much she can adapt that voice. So The Vegetarian, Human Acts, The White Book all feel like completely different novels and universes, despite having a strong Kang flavour running through them. And I think that's really quite impressive. Next up, we have Yukio Mishima with Confessions of a Mask, translated by Meredith Weatherby. And this is one of those books that is a bit of a classic and has had this role, I guess, in literature. It's sort of seen as one of those books that you should read at some point. I'm glad I read it. I don't know if I necessarily loved it. This is the complicated part of what this book is for me. I read it as part of a book club, and the discussion was really interesting and brought out a lot more in it than I'd thought was in it, essentially. You know, my reading of the book versus what other people had brought to it, I thought was really fascinating. And my main issue with it, I suppose I should start with what the core idea of this book is. The story is a semi-autobiographical tale of a young man who essentially realizes that he likes men, and he is trying to keep this mask, hence the title, of being sort of doing what a typical quote unquote man is meant to do. And so he has this girlfriend who he isn't always great to, and kind of keeps along for the most part as a shield. But there's also something more tender to their relationship than that. It's not just that she's a prop for him to appear straight. There's also some degree of care and love for her. But the book largely also traces his fantasies of being with men, which are often incredibly violent and have this very serious and dark overtone to them. And so he just feels like this incredibly conflicted narrator. And there are some parts that mirror Yukio Mishima's own life, in the sense that he had a wife, and that he also very much liked men, and many of his other books show that there's this sort of this thing that kind of cuts through around something vaguely sadomasochistic. There's a lot of violence in that, and in some of his other work, from what I hear, and in this book definitely there is. And so it's quite strange to try and unpick what is happening in this book in some ways, because there are these moments where I think the prose really lifts, and it's almost euphoric with these beautiful details or these insights. I think what I sometimes found tricky is that the narrator is so stuck in his pattern of thinking that we sometimes can't escape that as the reader, and so sometimes it feels like it's not moving along. And I guess that's the point. His life isn't moving along, and there's this backdrop of Japan in World War II and various other things happening. But I found him a really tricky narrator, because we are in his thoughts, but yet we don't really seem to get very far. It feels like we are being held off. And I get that there's probably an intentional literary device there, but it also makes it a frustrating read. So I struggled with it. I think there's a lot to really applaud about the book, but a lot that I found quite tricky to get into at the same time. Next up, I read The Last Dream by Pedro Almodóvar, and translated by Frank Wynne, who's done loads of really great translations. And this is a set of short stories that have this really interesting feel to them, because at times these feel like Pedro Almodóvar himself is just writing a brief diary extract about who he is and his life, because they directly reference him being a film director and about films that he's worked on. And other times they are far more fictional. But all together, they form this patchwork that's quite strange, because they are both completely fantastical at times and have this real sense that he is just telling you a story about hanging out with famous people or something. So it's an interesting book, and I really like his approach to writing these tales. They are somewhat there are some juicy elements to them. There are silly or fantastical elements, and they are fun and quite funny at the same time. I think sometimes they fell a little, I don't know, I kind of wanted a little bit more from them, because I felt like some of these short stories had a little bit more to give and ended just as they were getting started. But at the same time, it's a really interesting insight into this sort of demi-monde of being a film director, but also his really vivid imagination. I've only seen a few of his films, maybe a couple, I think, and I've really loved what I've seen from him. So it's interesting to see him in a completely different medium. And he even writes about this, that for him, some of these short stories were things he wrote 30, 40 years ago. Some of them he wrote really recently. And so this is him kind of gathering up a life's work of random patches of writing to put together. And sometimes it does feel like that, but there's something interesting about that patchwork element that feels quite fun at the same time. And last but not least, we have Maurice and Maralyn by Sophie Elmhirst. And this is a non-fiction book, but almost reads like fiction. Essentially, Maurice and Maralyn were a couple who were shipwrecked for several months out in the middle of the ocean. And there was an original book that was written at the time by the couple. They both sort of did various parts of bits of writing to talk about their experience and their ordeal of how they survived. And this really fantastical incredible story of what that looked like. But what I think this book does really interestingly is tell that story, but surround it by these other pieces of almost marginalia that are related to it. So it looks at what was going on when they landed, when they got back home and they were safe, and the way they told their stories, but then the way the public very quickly moved on and didn't necessarily want to hear a great deal more from them about anything else they had to do, so their other writing or whatever. It's also quite compelling to hear these other stories about how they were received in a broader sense. So part of what happens, without spoiling any details of it, at one point there are a couple of people who were also saved. And this leads them to these other wild adventures where the governments of those countries really want to take them in to say, hey, look, thank you so much for looking after one of our own. And they become big news stories elsewhere as well. So it's this really odd story, but really at the heart of it is this beautiful love story between these two. And particularly at the end of the book, without, again, spoiling anything, the way that this couple both reflect on their life, but also on what it might be, what it might mean for one of them not to be there, is really quite touching and really quite profound. So yeah, I really greatly enjoyed this book. It's quite a strange one, but no worse off for that. I really liked the slight patchwork nature of this, that it feels very non-fiction and very fiction at the same time. I thought it was really, really, really well done. So those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're doing really, really well and keeping well in what, for us at least in the UK, is cold and wet mostly. But I hope you're doing very, very well and are having a good week. Enjoy your reading. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye. Take care.